Hi, this is Dan Reimold with the leading journalism blog College Media Matters and the book Journalism of Ideas, which one supporter kindly calls, quote, the next new mandatory text for college journalists. This is the 1 Million Story Ideas podcast. Like my book, the podcast is built atop the notion that inside every person, place, thing, event, issue, trend, tweet, status update, breaking news alert, there are also tons of ideas. Good ones, newsworthy ones potentially worth reporting. Okay, so let's see what ideas we can come up with from some in-the-moment news that's happening. Literally, as I'm reporting this podcast, far and away the lead story of the day is some political hot water that New Jersey Governor Christie has found himself in. Apparently without his knowledge, and I'm sure this is going to get more fun and complicated even by the time I post this thing, or probably literally as I'm recording. Without his knowledge, so he says, a high-level aide snarled traffic on a prominent New York-New Jersey bridge for, I believe, a few days last fall, right around the start of the public school year, potentially as political retribution against a supporter of the opponent to the governor in his most recent re-election campaign. It's a fun and kind of crazy issue if you're into the political game. The analysts are eating it up as kind of an off-cycle presidential campaign story. A lot of interesting elements involved. It also has a lot of interesting story ideas. If you kind of look for the buzzwords and sort of side elements that obviously what we're trying to do here play into the higher ed or student arenas, as we're obviously trying to gear this toward the student press. One thing that comes to mind right away is the idea of people accusing Christie, or at least his political apparatus, of basically waging a bullying campaign. So whether he knew or not, he definitely had an aide or maybe a few aides, and maybe it's a larger notion of what his campaign is doing, of kind of employing these sort of tactics. The word bullying definitely caught my eye. It definitely can play into a number of stories that might be interesting on the student level. I think cyberbullying is probably the key buzzword that also then spins off of this story that I think really plays a part in what students either deal with or at least see from afar on a fairly regular basis. The craziest story I've seen in recent times regarding this was just in this recently wrapped college football season, in which a young woman, student journalist at University of Arizona, was cyberbullied extremely brutally. As she jokes, kind of sardonically, I was the least popular person on Twitter, according to some fans of a rival football team, rival school, for at least one weekend. For some comments that she made in a blog post in which you were supposed to be purposely snarky, she got attacked. And just good proof, and unfortunately solid proof that this cyberbullying is really out there, and it would be interesting to get students' takes on this and to see maybe if there are any victims or even perpetrators of this type of behavior, or what's sort of accepted and not nowadays in that sphere. I think obviously the easiest spin-off type stories to do here from this would be pulling out the idea of the traffic jam, obviously thinking cars, and not so much literally traffic jams then when you think of the college spheres, but when you're thinking of jams and cars, you're thinking parking. It's the most cliche type of story to do. But there are some interesting elements that are maybe worth a fresh look. So if you do these types of stories right, so everything here about, there's never enough spaces, in campus lots. And obviously also, just as example stories, which are easy Google finds, there's always increases in parking fees. But the craziest story I've ever seen regarding this was back a few years ago when a longtime professor at a college at somewhere in Canada literally retired on the first day of classes, if I'm remembering this story correctly, after circling the lot and not finding a parking spot. And apparently it's very tough to get parking there, and he finally said enough is enough. But there's some interesting elements here, and I've seen some past stories that might provide some inspiration for original reports of your own. I think one is there's always the story about students, maybe faculty and staff as well, complaining about the increase in parking fees. But I often don't see the next step in these stories, which is following the money. Where is this money going? I've seen some interesting elements here in that, it's one thing to say, well, we've got to, upkeep everything, pave the lines, and, fill in the gaps in the roads over time. But there's apparently also interesting elements depending on where the schools are located. The schools might actually be leasing or paying some sort of monthly fee to their city or township or wherever they're located simply to have the parking units available. Depending on kind of the type of structures they have in a certain place, they have to pay a certain fee. And apparently parking type structures or simply lots are not cheap. But it'd be interesting to see what else is this money being used for. And I think I would not only include the fees, but also the fines that students pay. Where are the more creative places that students are finding to park? What are neighbors, of campus thinking of maybe parking overflows? What are some of the most ridiculous or outlandish stories that students have of trying to find spots when they're late, running late for classes? Another interesting, sort of buzzword that rang in my head was simply the idea of the public records request that some of the New Jersey newspapers put together to get to the bottom of this Christie story, in which they were able to find some of the email and, off the top of my head, I believe text records. I'm going to go with definitely email there to really get a sense of how this was going down. This definitely reminds me of a very interesting story that the Daily Texan broke earlier, but about a year ago, so last February, in which a random records request that they made to the school at the University of Texas, simply involving the phrases, I believe it was inappropriate conduct or inappropriate relationship, revealed that one of the football coaches, I believe now ex-coach, purged in the whole Charlie Strong, new coaching hire, had engaged in some sort of inappropriate relationship, I believe, with a student at the time at the school. And this was not something that was released or talked about when it actually happened. But through this records request, they were able to find it out. So never forget the power of the public records request. When's the last time you made a request? Is this something you can do being at a public school? Even if you're at a private school, is there maybe some more creative ways to do it with schools in your area, or simply maybe some local government agencies? There's always certain pieces of information that are available, and it might be worth a fresh look to kind of see what is out there. The idea of the political mechanisms involved led me to one other interesting notion here, which is the idea of kind of the second day stories as this scandal has intensified has been, what does this mean for Chris Christie's 2016 seemingly all but inevitable presidential run? And so that immediately leads my mind in the student arena to obviously the political leaders, so to speak, at the student level, which of course is student government or student association officers. What are the electioneering rules and processes on your campus? What are some of the more interesting tactics that students have taken? I remember at LSU, for example, just a few years back, there were literally videos being made that went viral, and I believe helped some candidates, campaigns out. What is, against the rules? What are some behind-the-scenes or undercover things that typically are done? When do things maybe get nastier? And then kind of bleeding it into Christie, something I've written about on my own blog and talked to some of the student reporters about. For example, at Ball State University, the Ball State Daily News decided to report on the incoming SGA president's battle flag, the fact that she used to have what equates to like a Confederate flag. I believe it was hanging in her dorm room, and trying to figure out at the time from an ethical perspective, is that something that is pertinent to what students might need or want to know about her, as now she is obviously a sort of de facto leader or representative of them on campus. So kind of interesting, the idea of what do we need and want to know about our candidates? What is fair game? Kind of at least loosely relating to the idea of how much this can or should play a part in Christie's all but inevitable run in 2016. I was trying to think of more off-the-wall stories as well, and something that you can do in a new media sense. And the one thing that really comes to mind, I think you have to do this with exactly the right tone, is maybe the notion of simply sampling students on campus, maybe getting them on camera, putting together some sort of collage, man on the street, sort of vintage type quick cut video. Maybe getting with a hashtag together some sort of Twitter response of maybe things students, maybe faculty and staff as well, would like to do kind of with a smile as quote unquote mock revenge. Let's just say against the school or certain elements of the college or university, maybe based on a traumatic or embarrassing situation that they once went through. I think the key here, and I put up what I'm going to call it for this video, Stuff Sorority Girls Say video. It's just an example of how I think you'd want to do it lighthearted. And I think make it quick cut, so it's just students maybe telling their brief story and then what they would do to get revenge. And I think the key here, of course, is not making it personal, against a specific professor, at least maybe not naming names, not making it too vindictive or mean-spirited. But I think if done with a smile, it could be kind of fun to get a sense of how students might enact some, quote-unquote political revenge, or just revenge on maybe something that happened to them in the campus cafeteria, or maybe the library, or maybe a certain professor without being named, or a certain type of class or major or program, that maybe did something to them that, justifiably or not deserves some sort of revenge. And I think with the right hashtag or right cuts to a YouTube video, that could be a kind of fun, off-the-wall idea that, again, would at least in some way be related to this Christie ongoing scandal. Okay, so that's the 1 Million Story Ideas podcast for the day. Again, my name is Dan Reimold. Check out more content on collegemediamatters.com and look for the 1 Million Story Ideas tab. Thanks so much, guys.